Yeah, so I am the same Simone that used to work for Turning Point as well. So I know many of you know me from maybe about 10 years ago. So I married a Kiwi and moved across the ditch. So I'm just going to take you through a sort of a romp through this study and with some practical implications at the end that hopefully will be helpful to you. So I'd like to acknowledge that this research was supported by ALH Group as well as Crown Casino, and without them we couldn't have done this work. So when I say supported, they facilitated access to their venues for this research. The current project that you're seeing is funded by the Victorian Responsible Gambling Foundation and was with Dr. Kathleen Baggett at the Florey Institute and Vic Manning and Dan Lubman at Turning Point, where the research was conducted. So we really came to this research because of other studies we were doing looking at self-help strategies about how people change their gambling. And so we've done a bunch of work looking at the sorts of things people do. And these are like, you know, the messaging you see of, leave your cards at home or don't gamble more than you can afford, that type of stuff. So we went through a big program of identifying all the different things people might do to limit or reduce their gambling. And it resulted in us identifying 100 different strategies people use. We grouped those into categories of 15 strategies, and then we did this fancy analysis that looked at the relationship between the use of the strategy and how helpful it was. And so this graph here shows that relationship. So people said, the top one up there is cognitive, and this is things like thinking about other ways you could spend your money, was rated as people used it a lot, and they also said it was helpful. You can see down the bottom, self-exclusion, not that many people said they used it, and they kind of, helpfulness was like this. So the ones in circles are ones that were specifically related to something someone could do in a gaming venue. So we called it consumption control, because it was when the person was in the venue and they had to, manage their consumption. So these included things like playing low denomination machines, not withdrawing cash, not borrowing from a family member. The other things we found that were related to venue were planning in advance how much money to spend in the venue. So you can see here what we found is, particularly around the consumption control, they were kind of moderately helpful and they were kind of used most of the time, but not all the time. So this really led us to this current study of looking just at those strategies and how we might help people to implement them better. So our broad aim was to examine these sorts of behaviours and then look at whether we could develop a really brief intervention to help people to stick to their limits around that. So I'm going to give you the overview of the methods and then look at each part of the study separately rather than repeat, and that's very dull when people repeat. So basically we went into 11 venues in Victoria, and that was Crown as well as 10 metro and rural venues. And we screened 360 gamblers in the venue, in the foyer, and the screening was for intending to set a limit as well as gambling in the next hour. So as you would know, not everybody that goes to a gambling venue is intending to gamble. So, about a third of people were screened out because they were there to have a meal or to watch sport or have a drink. So we ended up with 184 gamblers that we interviewed in the foyer before gambling, and we gave them a little card of what they said they were going to do, and they brought that back to us at the end, and so we recruited 155 post-gambling. So some venues, there was one particular venue that was having renovations, and so people managed to escape us quite a lot in that venue. I don't know, like if it was a bit of a little pokey venue anyway, and it had lots of exits and people sort of got away. But most people, you can see, came back. So this is kind of interesting to us because it seems like, it's feasible. We did this over 2.5 weeks. It wasn't a long period to recruit that many people. So that was quite good. We used a bunch of measures, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So the overall demographic is quite similar to the ATM study that was done a few years ago by Anna Thomas. So you might remember the removal of the ATMs, so that was a good one to compare against because it was also done with a similar method of recruiting in the venue. So we had, fairly even split between gender. People were older, so they were early, now when I say older, I'm 50 now, so I say like 56, they're still quite young, aren't they? So the average age was 56. you can see the rest of this. So the most important part is that we had 2/3 of people that were no problem or low risk gamblers according to the Problem Gambling Severity Index, and 1/3 that had moderate or problem gambling. And again, that reflects kind of the characteristics of what we see in other studies in venues. So we developed 3 sort of separate studies from the research, and I'll talk you through those now. So the first one was to develop a tool because we wanted to be able to ask people, well, you know, what are you actually doing to limit your gambling? And we knew that we had the 14 or 15 strategies from our earlier study, but we thought perhaps that's not, we weren't really focused on that. So we went to the broader literature, and that turned out to be an absolute nightmare. And the reason for that is that it's not one literature. So this is kind of just a bit of a tip for you if you ever go looking for something, that this setting limits and sticking to limits lives in 3 different places. So there's in responsible gambling literature, which is what I know most of you are affiliated with. And the way that this is described in the literature is a top-down industry response to needing to minimise or reduce harm, right? So that sounds about right. So, and the idea of that is that it includes, you know, environmental modifications like pop-ups and RG training and pre-commitment, that type of thing. At the same time, there's another literature called protective behavioural strategies, and these came from alcohol studies in the US. And these alcohol studies were around college student drinking. So, you know, what do you know about college student drinking? They're going to drink. They drink. There's nothing you're going to be able to do to stop them drinking. So these researchers looked at, from Harvard, how can we reduce the harms and the amount of drinking that the college students are doing. And so they've done, there's probably about 100 randomised controlled trials, specifically looking at how you can encourage college students to use certain strategies to protect themselves. So these are referred to as a bottom-up approach. So it's not coming to the person, it's encouraging them to do that. Now the other thing that we've been working on, as I said before, is behaviour change strategies. And so this is where the person has identified that they want to reduce their gambling because they've got a problem of some sort. And these strategies include sort of broader things like, alternative activities, getting social support, looking after your health and well-being, avoiding venues altogether, that kind of thing. So we know that most people that have had a gambling problem that continue to gamble, there's about half of people. It's around that. Like, abstinence is not the end goal as frequently as it was. So we developed this screen from these 3 literatures, and really when we think about those 3 literatures, there's quite a lot of crossover in the items. It's just about how they're used. So if you are asking someone without a problem, what do? They say, well, I only take to the venue, the cash I need. But you could ask a problem gambler, what do you do? And they say, oh, I only take to the venue the cash I need. So it's actually the same strategy, but the intention is different. So, but what we do get in the middle is a crossover in terms of sticking to the limits. So this is where we kind of get interested here, because it's about sticking to the limits, not so much about the rest of it. Now I'll explain that a bit more. So we ended up with this 30 item screen, and this was reviewed by multiple people, including Nadine, thank you Nadine, and to make sure we had a comprehensive list of items. We administered this to our sample that I talked on before, and the first 5 items were all used more frequently by no problem, low risk gamblers than by moderate risk or problem gamblers. So they used only the money they brought into the venue, they only played low denomination poker machines, they planned in advance their exact spending, and then used willpower to be able to stick with that. So, and viewing gambling as entertainment. So these are all things you've heard of, right? This is not news at this point. But what is news here is that we identified 36 different things people are currently doing, and that some of this looks different. So what do you then do with this? Well, one of the things we found is that when we asked people over 30 days, how frequently have you used these strategies, gamblers use a lot of these strategies, and they use different combinations over that period of time, and they said they used an average of 14 different strategies. 2 were used by all gamblers regardless of gambling severity, and that were the 2 up there. And we also asked them, what strategies would you recommend and what strategies would you avoid, and we got consistent findings. And you can see the difference that I've just highlighted. Now the picture of the dog, it's a bit of a stretch, I just like it. But what it is talking about is we don't really know then how the person does those strategies. So they say they set a limit and only take that into the venue, but it's a little bit unclear about how that actually happens. And that we know through other research that we've done is typically people set these strategies, but then they fail at implementing the strategies. So this means they might choose a strategy that doesn't really meet their needs. So it might be that they set a time-based strategy and they lost all their money shorter than that time, and then that strategy kind of got overturned quite quickly. They also do things like, choose things that are unrealistic or choose strategies that they can easily abandon. And so these are issues around implementation that we wanted to be able to help people to fix. So we moved then into the actual research of the trial and what we did, and looking to the literature, one of the justifications was Robert Ladouceur's study a couple of years ago that reported that most of the in-venue work doesn't have a great deal of theory behind it, and could be better supported by research about it working. So this led us to look at a theoretical approach and to use a randomised controlled trial, which gives you that evidence about whether something's working or not. So I know people don't like theory, and someone said to me the other day, you really want to talk about theory? But it's an easy theory. Don't be afraid. So this theory is a theory of planned behaviour. It is the most widely used theory in psychology, health psychology. All it says is that when you have an intention to do something, like do exercise first thing in the morning, whether you do it or not is dependent on the strength of that intention. So if you go to bed the night before and go, yeah, I might get up in the morning and do exercise, what's your chances of doing the exercise? Yeah. If you go, I've got my shoes out, I've got them next to my bed, I've got my clothes out, I'm getting up at 6:45, I'm going at 7. What's the chances of you doing that? It's much better, right? So all this theory says is those intentions predict behaviours. But what then it predicts intentions is our attitudes towards it. So how important it is for us to do that. So at the end of the year, I'm doing a 77-kilometre hill walk up and down the South Island in New Zealand. And so that exercise is starting now. So in terms of attitudes, you can see that if you have a strong reason for doing it, it then feeds into the intentions. Subjective norms is what other people think about your behaviour, and if it's important for a partner that the person reduces their gambling, for example, that's going to impact on the intentions. And the last one is perceived behaviour control, which is synonymous with self-confidence or efficacy, right? So if the person believes they can actually carry it out. Now, researchers have found recently that there's this gap between intentions and behaviour for complex behaviours. So most of this research was done with health and things like, taking out your contact lenses at night, flossing, that kind of sort of simple behaviour. But addictions are not especially simple. And what the researchers have found is there's this gap between having a good intention and doing what you said you were going to do. And so they identified that these simple planning techniques, action and coping planning, were a way of being able to bridge the gap between that intention and behaviour. So it's literally what I said before about, if you want to exercise in the morning, you plan to get your shoes out, what time are you going to get up? So it's the how, what, when. Now, that if you're someone that's already done this, what can get in the way of doing that? That is a question for you. What can get...
Making the plan?
Yeah, of doing it. So you get up in the morning, 6:45. Weather, thank you. So weather is the most common reason why people don't exercise in the morning. And so that's where the theory has that you have to have a backup plan for contingencies when things go wrong. So it's raining, what do you do then? Maybe you could go anyway. So we did this. This was the intervention that we did in the venue. So we asked people to write a plan about what they were going to do to stick to their limits. and then we asked them to come up with a backup plan about what they were going to do if something got in the way of their plan. So a frequent thing that people talked about getting in the way was saying, you know, I'm only going to spend $50 and they don't get a win and that money goes in 10 or 15 minutes, but they had planned to gamble for an hour. So this is a problem because their response is to go and get more money, in which case they've overturned their initial plan. And that's where you need the backup plan of what to do when that happens, for example. Does that make sense? Yeah, so we asked people before they went in, what are you going to do? And then we asked them, how did it go afterwards? So we also asked people at 30 days, and so when they came out of the venue after gambling, we said, how much money are you planning to spend in the next 30 days? And we used a calendar-based system that's called the timeline follow back, but we use it forward. And we asked people, you know, to write out in a calendar, when are you going to gamble, how much are you going to spend in the next 30 days? And so on average, you know, actually, how much do you think on average people said? Like, what was the common?
30 days?
Yeah, 30 days. 4 weeks, let's call it 4 weeks. Yeah, so it's either, like, it's multiples of 50 typically, right? So it's $50 a week or 100, you know, that type of thing. And that's exactly what we found people said. So overall, we asked people in that one session, did you stick to your limit? And most gamblers said they stuck to their limit. 7 out of 7 stuck to the limit. We had a median spend of $50, so we used a thing called a median, which means you take the whole sample, you look at the middle point. And the reason why we do that is because, as you know, the spending of the tail, so we recruited in crowd, and so there were some, you know, of big spenders in our group. So if you take an average, the average moves, so you'll see median throughout. So they had a median spend of $50. We used the outcome measure of how closely people stuck to their limits. So what did you say you wanted to do? What did you actually do? And then we used that as a ratio. So most stuck to their limits, especially for the no problem, low risk gamblers. And you can see 3 out of 4 gamblers that were moderate risk problem gamblers stuck to their limits. In terms of pre-post, there was no difference in the ratio of intention spent, no difference in the ratio of no problem low risk gamblers, and the pre-post difference were that the moderate risk problem gamblers in the intervention intended to spend more, $100, but they actually spent less. So the intervention pre-post, they spent less in that venue than what they intended. So that's kind of good. It's good, but the next graph is better. So the next graph looks at what actually happened 30 days later from having that 20-minute session in the venue. The blue bars here are the no problem low risk gamblers in the control group. They had previously spent $150 over a month. In the venue, they said that they would spend $100 for the next month, and they spent $110. This is the no problem low risk gamblers in the intervention. They had previously spent $120. They intended to spend $80 and they spent $75. So it was about the same, but they actually reduced their intentions a little bit after the intervention. Now the moderate risk problem gamblers, these are the control group. So over the past month, the median spend was $400. They intended to spend $200 and they actually spent $500 in that next month. So again, the median. So there's a lot of variability around that. So now the big news, drum roll, is what happened to the problem gamblers in the intervention. And so what you can see is they started slightly less, but that wasn't significantly different. So they had previously spent $300, they intended to spend $200, and they actually spent $290 in the next month. So they spent more than they intended, but they spent half as much as the people in the control group. So this is quite promising. Our numbers were kind of a little bit low around this, so we had about 25 people in each group, which is less than optimal. It was an exploratory study. It was a relatively small amount of money, this study. But it's promising that the gamblers in that month after spent half as much as those that didn't get the intervention. So we kind of was like, this is very interesting. So it looks like a brief intervention is feasible. We were able to recruit, and it probably doesn't make that much difference for no problem, moderate risk, low risk gamblers. But for problem gamblers and moderate risk gamblers, it looks like it does something. And this is consistent with the theory. So one of the issues that we then had was half of the sample had already developed their plan before they came to the venue. So they had already decided how much they were going to spend, and they'd already left their cards at home or done something before they came to the venue. So this sort of raises some questions to us about what happens before the person comes to the venue. It also raised some questions in that when our research assistants, who weren't gambling experts, were prompting the participants on coming up with a backup plan, both the research assistants and the participants really struggled to have a backup plan. So they said, no, my plan is that I brought in the cash I want to spend today. I don't have a backup plan. So half of our sample could not come up with a backup plan. Now, just bringing in the cash that you're planning to spend is not 100% foolproof strategy, because frequently people also bring their cards in as well. So that's sort of like, oh, okay, what are we going to do about that? And then we really wondered, well, is it really true that everybody sticks to their limits? And this seemed a bit dubious. Maybe it was because 4 out of 5 of the research assistants were very nice young ladies that had talked to people for a while before they went in. Maybe just the fact that you talk to someone about what you were planning to do is enough to make you stick to that. Maybe you don't even need an intervention. The other thing that we wondered was, well, maybe people are actually not sticking to their limits all the time. So this led us to this final study that looked at the characteristics and experiences of busts or exceeding limits. And I need to take you just on a brief journey to help you understand this. So you're all familiar with the term lapse and relapse, right? This is a common sort of language we use in gambling. And so lapse is literally when someone returns to a previous behaviour. So they might have said, I'm only gambling $20 once a month, and they've stuck to that for a while, and then they've gone back to sort of doing that, spending more than that. They've gone back and they've spent $50, $100. A relapse is defined as when a person does that and then does it again and again and again until they're back to that original behaviour. Does that kind of make sense? That's what we know. But the issue with a lapse or a relapse is that you have to have made a decision to change your behaviour. So you can't have a lapse or a relapse without having a decision to change your behaviour in the first place. And so people without problems clearly are not making a decision to change their behaviour. So then how do you kind of understand the idea that someone would exceed their limits if they haven't made a decision to change their behaviour? Are you still following me? So what we identified was that actually colloquially gamblers will call this a bust. I had a bust. And a bust we defined as gambling more than intended in a single day that may or may not occur with a lapse or a relapse. So according to self-regulation theory, we all have our own personal standards and about what's okay. So it's very interesting that when you ask people, most people, who plays a game on their phone of some sort of game? I'm currently playing Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. It's not very good. So thank you. So usually people will have a time-wasting game on their phone that they might play on transport. You might play late at night or when you're home. If you've had a bad day, you might play it for a little bit longer than you normally would. Does that sound about right? Or maybe you watch Netflix or you do something else like this as a little bit of a wind down. Now, if the person was playing a game, for example, and they started to buy some tokens or some credits or something, they spent $1.99, and they did that 4 or 5 times, they might have spent $10. For someone that thinks that's a terrible thing to do and a terrible waste of money, $10 would be a bust, right? So if you spent $10 on Candy Crush, you would think that was terrible. And so if you think about it in terms of your own personal standards, we can apply that to gambling as well. And so we asked gamblers, over the last 12 months, have you had a time when you went past your personal limits? And we found that nearly 50% of gamblers said that they had a time when they went past their limits. And you can see that the frequency percentage across the sample, 20% of no problem gamblers said they had had a bust, 35% of low risk gamblers, and then around 80% of moderate risk and problem gamblers. So this is, I think, quite interesting information because it's akin to having an episode that's essentially could cause harm when the person has spent well over what that they would normally consider acceptable. And the amount of busts range between $20 and $1,500 in a single episode of gambling. The mean for that was $446 of one episode. So this raises quite a few questions in terms of how these things happen. And so you can see it there, we asked people, well, what was your reason? Tell us about how this happened. And there were two sort of reasons for the bust. The first were about pre-venue, so the person was feeling bad. So I recall I spoke to a woman who said that, you know, I'm here because I lost my brother yesterday. And this is a common, I'm sure you've all heard these types of stories, that the person has had a personal tragedy in their life and they want to forget. So have you heard those stories before? So, and they came to gamble because of that. And that was more frequent in the problem gambler, moderate risk gambler group. For others, they said they just didn't set a limit, they didn't set a time limit, and they didn't leave their cash at home or wanting to win some money to pay bills. For another group, they were more in venue, and so that was commonly around chasing win spins or chasing losses. So people would say, you know, and I'm sure you all know about this as well, that you know, once a person has paid so much money on the machine that they don't want to leave it until they get the free spins. Not that there is a free spin per se. And so you can see the quote up the top where the person said, the problem is staying on the same machine. I put so much money in that I didn't want to leave. I get stuck on one machine. And down in the corner too, I didn't set a limit. I was just wanting to see what happened and I didn't get the free spins. The other thing that happened in the venue was thinking that the win was going to come, that they were there with friends and everyone was gambling and they kind of lost sense of their own limits in that, and that they lost the money too quickly. So there were these sorts of two reasons for these busts occurring. So some about what the person brought into the venue and some about what happened in the venue. So this is the first study to our knowledge that has really looked at the idea of busts in gamblers that don't have serious problems. And so we know a little bit about lapse or relapse, but we were unable to find sort of anything written about no problem of moderate risk gamblers or low risk gamblers having these busts. And it sort of, you know, flags that we need to find out a little bit more about this. It also suggests that it would be helpful to have some sort of mechanism to support gamblers or to protect gamblers from having a bust. And so it's a little bit like us having a seatbelt. You know, I've had a vague accident, touch wood, once in my life, but I wear a seatbelt every day. And so it is a little bit like this in that, you know, for no problem, low risk gamblers who have a bust, having that protection is potentially helpful. And so then our last question, well, how come these busts weren't more frequent? And what we found when we were looking at this is the reason why gamblers didn't exceed their limits more frequently is that they actually set limits that were somewhat high. And in fact, our sample had a median intention for that venue spend of $50 for the no problem low risk gamblers and $75 for the moderate risk problem gamblers, and that's a median. And this is on average 60% above the recommended safe gambling limits or low risk gambling limits. Generally speaking, there is research that's been done in Canada and around the world, but mostly in Canada, and looking at the limits. But they're around about that amount. And so we asked, and this was based on the Australian recommendations from Deakin University and Nikki Dowling, we asked gamblers what they thought about the limits. So the limit is $40 in Australia, Victoria, $40 for each session, and no more than $300 a year on the pokies. And we asked gamblers what they thought about that, and the no problem low risk gamblers thought it was about right. And of course, as you might expect, the moderate risk problem gamblers thought it was a little bit low. But overall, our sample was intending to spend between 7 and 16 times the recommended limits. So you remember before that they were intending to spend $200 for the month? Well, that's half the, 75% of the yearly recommended limits. So that then raises questions for us about how you help people to reduce those limits. So they will continue to not exceed the limit if the limit's too low. So how can you facilitate those limits going down a little bit? And so there's two ways to do this. And the first one is that we continue to help gamblers to change their attitudes towards their spending limits. And so that's working on those sorts of things over on this side. The second part, and particularly where you guys come in, many of you, is around having responsible gambling programs that help support that space between intentions and behaviour. So these are things we know now what gamblers say they do. And so what we need is supportive mechanisms to support gamblers to stick to their limits and help them do what they're doing better, because it's not always working. So I have two sets of recommendations. The first is responsible gambling recommendations. So this is gamblers should have access to low-risk gambling guidelines. This is needed for the development of backup plans. So as Shane mentioned at the start, that I've done work across other areas, and we have these beautiful guidelines for sugar reduction and pornography reduction, which I brought for my trip to tell people about. But interestingly, I have a lot of pornography reduction books because no participants want the actual hard copies. They only want them online. But what these books talk about is how to develop plans and backup plans. And they come from consumers. So we actually mine consumer data from thousands and thousands of online forums about what people say work for them. So they are not professionally derived strategies. They come from consumers. And so we've just been funded by the New Zealand government to develop these types of things in New Zealand. And that came from this research, which is fantastic. So that will be available probably early next year. The gamblers should be provided evidence-based information on these strategies, that they should have access to some sort of self-assessment tool with normative feedback about, how much their spending compares against the recommendations, as well as what the rest of the general public spend on gambling. Ideally an app to help them set those limits, and that RG programs identify the best ways to support gamblers to set those limits before gambling, and then also to stick with them during the session. So I think even more practically and perhaps more helpfully, I think the advice to gamblers from this study is to select a strategy both before going into the venue and in a venue. So frequently the participants, they chose one before and then they didn't have a backup plan. More frequently, moderate risk problem gamblers only had an in-venue strategy, such as I'm just going to use my willpower to stick to my limits. Now, that's arguably not going to be a very good strategy. But what we've found is the best or optimal combination looks like having a plan beforehand and then having a plan in the venue about what you're going to do if you run into those barriers in the venue. So your plan is to spend this much, you lose your money in 15 minutes, what's your backup plan? Or you decide that to leave cards at home and you've spent your money but your friend's there still playing, the backup plan is not to borrow from your friend. So you preempt, the idea of the coping planning is to preempt the barriers that come up. And so does that make sense? So having those two plans. So, and that sort of leads on to the next one of ensuring that the strategy is not easily overturned. Now, we can do things to help people make sure their strategy cannot be easily overturned by looking at these strategies and how we can build supports around those. I mean, pretty much the most obvious one is reducing access to cash in the venues. If someone says, I'm only going to spend this much, and then they take their card and they can easily access cash, then that's how it gets overturned. Busts happen even if you are not a frequent gambler. If you have a bust, take a break from gambling for a while. So I used to play Candy Crush, and those that know me know I've got a bit of addictive personality, and my husband removed Candy Crush from my phone so that I couldn't play it anymore. Now thank you for your sad face. And so this is kind of the stories we heard from the no problem, low risk gamblers, that they had a bust and they took a break for a while. They just uninstalled gambling gambling in their minds for a while. The fourth one is always set a limit no matter what mood or frame of mind, and use the limit setting technology. And I think this is sort of the messaging around, you know, it's about having that safety all the time and not giving up the safety when you're in a bad mood or sad or depressed or want to escape. This is where the problems seem to come. And lastly, to use the low risk gamblers limits as a guide, intend to spend no more than $300 a year or 10 visits. And so this is probably the most controversial and most difficult strategy that people are currently trying to sort of grapple with, the idea of talking about, you know, what not to go past. But they're kind of some concrete things to perhaps think about. So I have some references that I'm very happy to provide you if you need those. And 2 of the 3 papers from this study have already been published, and the 3rd one's on its way. And then just a little plug at the end. So the Change Strategies Project is our website for all of these things, and we have a lot of free resources and around gaming and internet pornography and stuff like that. All right, thank you. I've got enough time for questions.